The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon when Margaret heard the first scream. She jolted awake in her small cabin, her heart already racing before her mind could understand what was happening. The sound came again. A woman's voice, high and desperate, coming from the direction of the Johnson homestead about a mile away. Thomas was already reaching for his rifle. Her husband moved quickly, but quietly, years of frontier life having taught him that silence could mean the difference between life and death. "Stay down," he whispered to Margaret. "Keep Samuel quiet." But 8-year-old Samuel was already awake, his blue eyes wide with fear. Margaret pulled him close, feeling his small body trembling against hers. Through the thin cabin walls, they could hear horses, many horses, and the sound of men shouting in a language she didn't recognize. Thomas peered carefully through a crack in the wooden shutters. His face went pale. "Comanche," he whispered. "At least 20 of them, maybe more." Margaret's blood turned to ice. They had heard stories from other settlers. Stories of raids, of families killed or captured, of entire homesteads burned to the ground. But somehow, she had always believed it wouldn't happen to them. Their little settlement of 5 families had been peaceful for almost 3 years. They had even traded with some of the local tribes, exchanging goods and keeping a careful peace. The sound of horses was getting closer now. Thomas checked his rifle and looked at Margaret with eyes that held both love and desperation. "If something happens to me, you take Samuel and run for the woods. There's a big oak tree about 200 yards behind the cabin. You remember, the one? Hide there and don't come out until you're sure they're gone." "Thomas, don't," Margaret started to say, but her husband was already moving toward the door. The attack came fast. One moment their small homestead was quiet in the early morning light. The next it was filled with the thunder of horses and the war cries of painted warriors. Margaret watched in horror through the window as their neighbor's cabin erupted, in flames. Mrs. Johnson came running out, her nightgown already catching fire only to be struck down by a Comanche lance. Thomas fired his rifle once, twice, then reached for his pistol. Margaret could see him shouting something, but the noise was too loud to hear his words. A Comanche warrior on a painted horse came riding straight at their cabin door. "Run!" Thomas yelled, turning to look at her one last time. "Take Samuel and run now!" Margaret grabbed her son's hand and pulled him toward the back door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the latch. Behind her she could hear Thomas firing his pistol. Then the sound of the front door splintering as it was kicked in. She and Samuel burst out of the back door and ran for the tree line. The boy stumbled, and Margaret half carried, half dragged, him across the open ground. Behind them she could hear fighting in the cabin, furniture breaking, men shouting, the sound of her husband's voice calling her name one last time. They made it to the big oak tree just as their cabin began to burn. Margaret pressed Samuel against the rough bark and held him tight, both of them breathing hard. Through the leaves they could see everything, their home going up in flames, their livestock being driven away, their few precious belongings scattered in the dirt. And then she saw Thomas. He was lying in the doorway of their cabin, not moving. Even from this distance Margaret could tell he was gone. The man who had built this homestead with his own hands, who had loved her since they were both 16 years old, who had dreamed of making a good life for their family on the frontier, he was gone. Samuel started to cry, but Margaret quickly covered his mouth with her hand. They couldn't make any noise, not yet. She could see Comanche warriors moving around their burning home, searching through what was left of their belongings. Some of them were painting their faces with ashes from the fire, while others seemed to be arguing about something. That's when she noticed one warrior who was different from the rest. He was enormous, taller than any man Margaret had ever seen, with broad shoulders and arms like tree trunks. While the other warriors celebrated their victory or searched for loot, this giant stood perfectly still, watching the flames consume her home. There was something about his stillness that frightened Margaret even more than the wild war cries of the others. He seemed to be studying the destruction, as if he was looking for something specific. His long black hair hung down his back, decorated with eagle feathers and beads. Even from a distance, She could see the scars that covered his chest, white, lines against copper skin that told stories of many battles. The giant warrior turned his head slowly, scanning the area around the burning homestead. Margaret pressed herself closer to the oak tree, pulling Samuel with her. For a terrifying moment, she thought the warrior was looking directly at them. His eyes seemed to pierce right through the leaves and branches to where they were hiding. But then one of the other warriors called out to him, pointing toward the other cabins in their small settlement. The giant nodded and walked toward his horse, a magnificent black stallion that seemed almost too small to carry such a large man. Margaret watched as the war party rode toward the Mitchell cabin, the last home in their little community. She wanted to warn them, to scream out an alert, but she knew it would only mean death for her and Samuel. All she could do was watch helplessly as the same terrible scene played out again. The Mitchells tried to run. Margaret could see old Henry Mitchell pushing his wife toward their root cellar, while he fired his shotgun at the approaching warriors. But there were too many of them, and they moved too fast. Within minutes, the Mitchell cabin was also burning, and the war party was gathering up everything of value they could find. Samuel had stopped crying, but he was shaking like a leaf in Margaret's arms. "Mama," he whispered, "where's Papa? Why isn't Papa moving?" Margaret couldn't answer. Her throat felt closed up like she couldn't breathe. How could she tell an 8-year-old boy that his father was dead? How could she explain that their entire world had just been destroyed in the space of a few minutes? The war party spent almost an hour going through the ruins of their settlement. They took horses, cattle, tools, anything that looked useful. They also took something else. Margaret watched in horror as several of the warriors brought out captives from the other homesteads. Mrs. Patterson from the far cabin was there, her hands tied behind her back. So was young Billy Johnson, who couldn't be more than 6 years old. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when she realized what this meant. The Comanche weren't just raiding for supplies, they were taking prisoners. And if they found her and Samuel... She held her son closer and prayed to God that they would stay hidden. The oak tree had thick, low branches that created a natural shelter, and they were far enough from the settlement that maybe, just maybe, the warriors wouldn't bother to search this far out. But then disaster struck. Samuel saw something that made him gasp out loud. One of the warriors was dragging Mrs. Patterson past their hiding spot, and the woman looked up and saw them. Margaret watched in horror as recognition dawned in Mrs. Patterson's eyes, and she opened her mouth as if to call out. Margaret shook her head desperately, silently begging the woman to stay quiet. Mrs. Patterson seemed to understand. She closed her mouth and looked away, but the damage was done. The Comanche warrior holding her had noticed her looking in their direction. He stopped and stared straight at the oak tree. Margaret held her breath and pulled Samuel deeper into the shadows of the branches. The warrior took a step toward them, then another. His hand moved to the tomahawk hanging from his belt. Margaret closed her eyes and prepared for the worst. This was it. They had been discovered. In a few moments, she and Samuel would either be dead or captives, and there was nothing she could do about it. But then she heard a voice, deep and commanding, calling out in the Comanche language. The warrior stopped walking toward their tree and looked back. The giant warrior was calling to him, gesturing toward the horses. It was time to leave. The warrior looked once more at the oak tree, shrugged, and walked away. Margaret didn't dare to breathe until she heard the sound of horses leaving, growing fainter and fainter as the war party rode away from their destroyed settlement. They stayed hidden in the oak tree until the sun was high overhead. Margaret wanted to make sure the warriors were really gone before she and Samuel came out. When she finally decided it was safe, she took her son's hand and walked back toward what had been their home. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. Everything was gone. Their cabin was just a pile of smoking ashes. Their barn had been burned down, and their few animals had been either killed or driven away. And there in the doorway lay Thomas, her beloved husband, still and cold. Samuel started to run toward his father, but Margaret caught him and held him back. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "Papa's gone to heaven now. We can't help him anymore." The boy looked up at her with eyes that seemed much older than his 8 years. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Margaret looked around at the destruction, at the bodies of their neighbors, at the smoke still rising from the... 3 days had passed since Margaret's world had burned to the ground, and she was starting to understand what it meant to truly survive in the wilderness. She and Samuel had been living on wild berries, creek water, and whatever edible plants she could remember from her childhood. Her stomach felt like it was eating itself, and Samuel had grown quiet and weak from hunger. But Margaret couldn't give up. Not when her boy was depending on her. Every morning, she would wake up under whatever shelter they had found. Sometimes a fallen log, sometimes just a thick clump of bushes, and tell herself that today they would find help. Today, they would reach safety. The problem was that Margaret had realized something terrible. The war party that had destroyed her settlement hadn't just disappeared into the wilderness. They were still out there, and based on the tracks she had found by the river, they were moving in the same direction she and Samuel needed to go to reach the nearest town. More than that, Margaret was starting to suspect that the Comanche weren't done with their raiding. She had found evidence of other camps, other fires, other signs that a large group was moving through this area. And if they were still nearby, they might have her neighbors, Mrs. Patterson and little Billy Johnson, as captives. The thought of those people being held prisoner gnawed at Margaret's mind. Mrs. Patterson had been like a sister to her, always, ready to help when Samuel was sick or when Margaret needed someone to talk to about the loneliness of frontier life. And Billy was just a baby, really, barely old enough to understand what had happened to his parents. On the third day, as Margaret was filling their water bottles at a creek about 10 miles from their destroyed settlement, she made a decision that would have seemed insane to her old self. She was going to follow the Comanche trail. Samuel looked at her like she had lost her mind when she explained her plan. "Mama, those are the bad men who hurt Papa. Why do we want to find them?" Margaret knelt down and took her son's hands in hers. They were both dirty and thin, their clothes torn from pushing through brush and sleeping on the ground. But Samuel's eyes still held trust in her, still believed that his mother could somehow make everything right. "Sometimes," Margaret said carefully, "the only way to save the people we love is to do something scary. Mrs. Patterson and Billy are out there somewhere, and they need help. And maybe we can find a way to help them." She didn't tell Samuel about the other reason she wanted to follow the Comanche trail. The truth was that she was starting to realize they might not survive much longer on their own. Winter was coming. They had no real shelter, and Margaret's knowledge of living off the land was limited. If they were going to die anyway, maybe it was better to die trying to help their friends. So they followed the trail. Margaret had learned basic tracking from Thomas, who had been an excellent hunter. The signs weren't hard to follow. A party of 20 or more warriors with horses and captives left clear marks on the landscape. Broken branches, horse droppings, the remains of campfires, and occasionally, more personal signs that made Margaret's heart ache. She found a piece of Mrs. Patterson's dress caught on a thorn bush. She found small footprints that could only belong to Billy Johnson. And sometimes when the trail passed through muddy areas near water sources, she could see the tracks of horses carrying double weight, a warrior and his captive. The trail led them deeper into Comanche territory, away from any hope of reaching white settlements. Margaret knew she was making a choice that could get them both killed. But something inside her, maybe desperation, maybe foolish hope, kept pushing her forward. On the evening of the third day, as the sun was setting behind the rolling hills of central Texas, Margaret smelled smoke. Not the wild scent of a grass fire or the clean smell of a lightning strike, but the deliberate smoke of campfires. Many campfires. She left Samuel hidden in a grove of mesquite trees and crept forward until she could see the Comanche camp spread, out in a valley below her. It was bigger than she had expected, not just the war party that had attacked her settlement, but what looked like an entire traveling village. There were dozens of teepees, hundreds of horses, and more people than Margaret could count. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the captives. They were sitting near one of the larger fires, their hands tied but otherwise seeming unharmed. Mrs. Patterson was there, looking tired and frightened, but alive. Little Billy was curled up next to her, and Margaret could see that Mrs. Patterson was trying to comfort the boy. But then Margaret saw something that made no sense at all. There was another child near the captives, a white boy with sandy hair who looked to be about Samuel's age. But this child wasn't tied up. He was playing with some Comanche children, laughing and running around the camp as if he belonged there. Margaret stared harder, trying to understand what she was seeing. The boy looked familiar somehow, and then it hit her like a physical blow. She recognized that laugh, that way of running with his arms pumping at his sides. It was Samuel. But Samuel was back in the mesquite grove where she had left him. Wasn't he? Margaret's mind reeled as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The boy in the camp looked exactly like her son, moved like her son, had the same bright hair and small build, but it couldn't be Samuel. It was impossible. Unless... A cold hand of fear gripped Margaret's heart. What if the Comanche had found Samuel while she was scouting the camp? What if they had taken him while she was gone? She turned and ran back, to the mesquite grove as fast as she could, branches catching at her dress and thorns scratching her arms. But Samuel was still there, exactly where she had left him, curled up asleep under a small bush. Margaret nearly sobbed with relief as she gathered him into her arms. He woke up startled, blinking in confusion. "Mama, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart, I missed you." Margaret held him tight, breathing in the familiar smell of his hair. But her mind was spinning. If Samuel was here with her, then who was the boy in the Comanche camp? She waited until Samuel was asleep again, then crept back to her observation point. The boy was still there, still playing with the Comanche children. And as Margaret watched, she began to notice other things. The boy was dressed in Comanche clothing now, buckskin pants and a small vest decorated with beads. His hair had been braided in the Comanche style with feathers woven into it. This wasn't a recent captive. This was a boy who had been with this tribe for months, maybe years. A boy who had been adopted into their way of life so completely that he seemed to have forgotten his original family entirely. Margaret was still trying to understand what she was seeing when she heard a sound behind her that made her blood turn to ice. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, and they were getting closer. She turned around slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and found herself looking up at the giant Comanche warrior who had stood over the ruins of her homestead 3 days ago. He was even more intimidating up close, tall as a tree, broad as a barn door, with scars covering his arms and chest that spoke of countless battles. But what frightened Margaret most was his eyes. They weren't filled with anger or bloodlust as she might have expected. Instead, they held a deep sadness that seemed to mirror her own grief. The warrior looked down at her for a long moment, then spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. "You follow us for 3 days?" "Why?" Margaret's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The warrior waited patiently, and finally Margaret managed to whisper, "My friends?" "You took my friends." The warrior nodded slowly. "The woman with gray hair, the small boy, yes, we took them. They are safe." "I want them back," Margaret said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "They have families. They have people who love them." "As did my son," the warrior replied quietly. "As did my wife." Margaret didn't understand what he meant, but something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. The sadness in his eyes wasn't just general melancholy. It was the specific grief of a parent who has lost a child. Margaret recognized it because she had seen it in her own mirror every day since Thomas died. "Your son?" she asked carefully. The warrior was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he spoke, his voice barely above, a whisper. "White soldiers came to our winter camp 2 moons ago. They said we had stolen horses. We had not. But they came anyway, with guns and fire. My son was 8 winters old. He tried to run. They shot him down like a rabbit." Margaret felt her heart clench. An 8-year-old boy, the same age as Samuel, shot down by soldiers who probably never bothered to learn his name or understand that he was just a frightened child. "My wife," the warrior continued, "she could not live with the pain. She walked into the river one night when the moon was dark. I found her body the next morning. Now Margaret understood the sadness in his eyes. This man had lost everything just as she had. His family had been destroyed by violence just as hers had been. They were both walking wounded, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to take away everyone they loved. "What is your name?" Margaret asked gently. "In your tongue, I am called Stands Like Mountain," the warrior replied. "But my people know me as Tachawicca. My name is Margaret Hayes, the boy you saw who looks like your son." Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat by Samuel's side watching him breathe, memorizing every detail of his sleeping face. His sandy hair fell across his forehead in the same pattern it had since he was a baby. His small hands were curled into loose fists, the way they always were when he was completely relaxed. Even in sleep, he looked so much like his father that Margaret's heart ached. How could she even consider Tachawicca's proposal? How could any mother think about trading away her own child? But as the hours passed and the stars wheeled overhead, Margaret found herself examining the terrible logic of the giant warrior's offer. Samuel was going to die if they stayed in the wilderness much longer. Margaret could barely find enough food to keep them alive for another day, let alone survive until winter passed. They had no warm clothing, no real shelter, and winter on the Texas frontier was harsh enough to kill grown men who were properly prepared. More than that, even if they somehow survived the winter, what kind of life would Samuel have? Margaret couldn't protect him from raiders, from wild animals, from disease, or from the 100 other dangers that claimed children on the frontier. She was one woman alone with limited skills and no resources. But if Samuel became Comanche, he would be part of a community. He would be trained to hunt and fight, to survive in a landscape that would otherwise kill him. He would have dozens of people looking out for him, protecting him, making sure he grew up strong and capable. The thought of giving him up made Margaret feel physically sick, but the thought of watching him slowly starve to death, or seeing him killed by the next band of raiders they encountered, was even worse. As dawn approached, Margaret made a decision that went against every maternal instinct she possessed. She was going to accept Tachawicca's offer, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only choice that gave Samuel a real chance at survival. When Samuel woke up, Margaret was ready for him. She had practiced what she was going to say, though the words still felt like broken glass in her throat. "Samuel," she said gently, brushing his hair away from his forehead, "I need to talk to you about something very important." Samuel sat up, immediately alert. 3 days of running and hiding had taught him to be ready for danger at any moment. "Are the bad men coming back, Mama?" "No, sweetheart. But we're going to go see them today." Samuel's eyes went wide with fear. "Why? Are they going to hurt us?" Margaret pulled him into her lap, holding him tight. "Do you remember the stories Papa used to tell you about Indian children? How they learned to ride horses and hunt buffalo and live under the stars?" "Yes," Samuel said carefully. "Papa said they were brave and strong. They are brave and strong. And Samuel, I think you could be brave and strong too if you wanted to learn their ways." Samuel looked up at her with confusion in his blue eyes. "I don't understand, Mama. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you're about to trade him away? How do you make a child understand that sometimes love means letting go?" "There's a man in the Indian camp," Margaret said slowly. "A chief named Stands Like Mountain. He lost his little boy, just like we lost Papa. He's very sad and lonely, and he needs someone to love and take care of. Like how you take care of me?" "Yes, exactly like that. And Samuel, I think maybe you could help make his sadness better. You could be his son, and he could teach you all the things Indian boys need to know." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing what his mother was telling him. Then he asked the question Margaret had been dreading. "But what about you, Mama? Who would take care of you?" Margaret's voice nearly broke, but she managed to keep it steady. "I would stay with you. Sweetheart, I would live with the Indians too, and we would still be together, just in a different way." It wasn't exactly a lie. Tachawicca had offered to let her stay, but Margaret knew that if she accepted his proposal, everything would change. "Samuel, would become a Comanche warrior, and she would become, what? The wife of a man who had killed her husband? The stepmother to a boy who had forgotten his own family? Samuel considered this for a moment, then nodded with the simple acceptance that only children possess. Okay, Mama. If it will make the sad man feel better, I can be his son too. Margaret had to turn away so Samuel wouldn't see her tears. Her 8-year-old boy was willing to sacrifice his entire identity to help a grieving stranger because his mother had asked him to. The trust he placed in her was both heartbreaking and overwhelming. They walked into the Comanche camp together as the sun was reaching its peak in the sky. Margaret held Samuel's hand tightly, both of them trying to look braver than they felt. The camp was busy with the activities of daily life. Women working on hides, men tending to horses, children playing games that looked very similar to the ones Samuel played back home. But as Margaret and Samuel walked through the camp, conversations stopped and people stared. Not with hostility exactly, but with curiosity and caution. Word had apparently spread about the white woman who had been following them, and everyone wanted to get a look at her. Tachawicca was waiting for them near the largest teepee in the camp. He was even more imposing in broad daylight, his scarred, chest gleaming with oil and paint, his long hair adorned with feathers and beads that spoke of his status as a war chief. But when he looked down at Samuel, his expression softened. "This is the boy," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. "This is Samuel. Samuel, this is the chief I told you about." Samuel looked up at the giant warrior with wide eyes, but he didn't hide behind his mother's skirt as many children might have done. Instead, he stepped forward and said politely, "Hello, sir. Mama says you're sad because you lost your little boy. I'm sorry that happened to you." Tachawicca stared down at Samuel for a long moment, and Margaret saw something shift in the warrior's expression. The careful mask of authority slipped, and for just a moment, she saw the grieving father underneath. "You are not afraid of me, little one?" Tachawicca asked. Samuel considered this seriously. "I'm a little afraid," he admitted. "But Mama says you need help, and Papa always taught me to help people when they need it." "Your Papa was a wise man," Tachawicca said gently. "What else did he teach you?" "He taught me to shoot a rifle and how to track animals and how to be brave when scary things happen. He said being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the right thing even when you are afraid." Tachawicca knelt down so he was closer to Samuel's eye level, though he was still much taller than the boy. "Would you like to learn more things? Would you like to learn to ride horses without a saddle and to hunt with a bow and arrow?" Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. "Could I really? Mama always said I was too little to ride horses by myself. Among my people, boys your age are already skilled riders. I could teach you if you wanted to learn." Margaret watched this exchange with a mixture of heartbreak and relief. Tachawicca was being gentle with Samuel, treating him with kindness and respect rather than as a piece of property to be traded, and Samuel, with a child's resilience, was already beginning to see this not as a loss, but as an adventure. "There is someone I would like you to meet," Tachawicca said to Samuel. He called out in the Comanche language, and a moment later, the boy Margaret had seen the night before came running over. Up close, the resemblance between this boy and Samuel was even more striking. They could have been brothers, the same height, the same build, the same bright hair color. But where Samuel still carried himself like a white settler's son, this boy moved with the confident grace of a Comanche child. "This is Little Hawk," Tachawicca said. "He came to us much as you are coming now, alone and in need of a family. Little Hawk, this is Samuel." The two boys stared at each other for a moment. Then Little Hawk smiled and said something in the Comanche language. Samuel looked confused, so Little Hawk switched to English. "Do you want to see my horse?" And just like that, the ice was broken. Samuel nodded eagerly, and the two boys ran off toward the horse herd, chattering like old friends. Margaret watched them go with tears in her eyes. "He will be safe," Tachawicca said quietly. "I give you my word as a chief and as a father, no harm will come to him while he is under my protection." "And Little Hawk, Margaret asked. What happens to him if Samuel becomes your son? Little Hawk will always be my son as well. I have room in my heart for 2 boys, just as you have room in your heart for children who are not of your own blood. Margaret looked at Tachawicca sharply. What do you mean? If you stay among us, you will help me raise both boys. Little Hawk remembers nothing of his white family, but he will need a woman's guidance as he grows, and Samuel will need someone who remembers the world he came from. You would be a bridge between the 2 parts of their lives. Margaret hadn't fully considered this aspect of the arrangement. She had been so focused on the idea of losing Samuel that she hadn't thought about what she might gain. Little Hawk needed a mother, and she needed children to protect and care for. In a strange way, they could help heal each other's losses. What about Mrs. Patterson and Billy? Margaret asked. You promised to return them. They will be taken to the edge of white territory and released with horses and supplies, Tachawicca assured her. They will be told that you and... The ceremony that made Margaret into Many Sorrows woman was both simpler and more profound than anything she had experienced in her old life. It took place 3 days after she accepted Tachawicca's proposal, when the camp's medicine man declared that the spirits were favorable for new beginnings. Margaret sat in the center of a circle of Comanche women, feeling their eyes on her as they painted symbols on her face and hands. The paint was made from clay and plant dyes, and it felt cool against her skin. Each mark had a meaning. The women explained in broken English mixed with gestures. The blue lines across her cheekbones represented the tears she had shed for her lost husband. The red dots on her forehead showed the blood price she had paid for her new life. Little Wolf. Margaret still thought of him as Samuel, though she was trying to learn his new name, sat nearby with Little Hawk, both boys decorated with their own ceremonial paint. They were giggling about something, switching easily between English and the Comanche words they were rapidly learning. It amazed Margaret how quickly children could adapt to new circumstances. But even as she watched her son embracing his new identity, Margaret felt the weight of what she had given up. The woman who had married Thomas Hayes, who had lived in a cabin with glass windows and a wood floor, who had owned a Bible and china dishes, that woman was being buried tonight under layers of clay paint and buffalo hide clothing. You are thinking of your old life, said a voice beside her. Margaret looked up to see an elderly Comanche woman with kind eyes and silver hair braided with beads. This was Grandmother Willow, Tachawicca's aunt, who had been designated to help Margaret learn the ways of the tribe. I am, Margaret admitted. Is that wrong? Grandmother Willow smiled. It would be wrong not to think of it. The dead deserve to be remembered even when the dead are the parts of ourselves we must leave behind. But tonight you must also look forward. My nephew is a good man who has suffered much. You both have the chance to heal if you let yourselves. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it yet. How could she heal from losing Thomas by marrying the warrior who had led the raid that killed him? How could she find happiness with a man whose people had destroyed everything she had ever known? But as the ceremony continued, Margaret began to understand something important. This wasn't just about her and Tachawicca. It was about Little Wolf and Little Hawk, about creating a family that could give 2 orphaned boys the love and stability they needed. It was about survival in its most basic form, people coming together to protect and care for each other in a harsh world. When Tachawicca appeared for the final part of the ceremony, he looked different than Margaret had ever seen him. Instead of war paint and weapons, he wore simple buckskin clothing, decorated with intricate beadwork. His long hair was braided with silver ornaments, and his scarred chest was covered with a vest that had been dyed deep blue. He knelt beside Margaret in the circle and spoke words in the Comanche language that she didn't understand, but somehow felt in her bones. The medicine man translated, I take this woman as my wife, not to possess her, but to walk beside her. I promise to protect her children as my own, to value her wisdom, and to help her find peace in her new life. Then it was Margaret's turn. The medicine man had taught her the words earlier, and she spoke them carefully in Comanche. I take this man as my husband, not from love but from need, not from joy but from hope. I promise to help him heal his grief, to raise his children with honor, and to build something good from the ashes of what we have lost. The words felt strange on her tongue, but they were honest. Margaret couldn't promise to love Tachawicca. She wasn't sure she would ever love anyone the way she had loved Thomas. But she could promise to try to build a life with him, to be a good stepmother to Little Hawk, and to help both boys grow into men who would honor the best parts of both worlds they came from. The ceremony ended with gifts. The women of the tribe had made Margaret a complete set of Comanche clothing. Soft deerskin dresses decorated with porcupine quills, warm winter robes lined with rabbit fur, and moccasins so comfortable they felt like wearing clouds. Tachawicca gave her a horse, a gentle mare with intelligent eyes who would carry her safely wherever she needed to go. But the most meaningful gift came from the boys. Little Wolf and Little Hawk approached her together, each carrying something in their hands. Little Hawk offered her a necklace made from carved bone and colored beads. "I made this for you," he said shyly, "so you won't forget that you're our mother now." Little Wolf's gift was simpler but somehow more precious, a smooth river stone that he had painted with symbols. "This is for you to remember, Papa," he said quietly. "The blue parts are his eyes, and the yellow parts are his hair, and the red part is his heart that loved us." Margaret had to turn away so the boys wouldn't see her crying. In the space of a few words, Little Wolf had managed to honor his father's memory, while also accepting his new life. If an 8-year-old could find that kind of balance, maybe she could too. The first weeks of Margaret's new life were harder than she had expected. Learning to live in a teepee was challenging enough. Everything was different from her old cabin, from the way cooking was done over an open fire to the way sleeping robes were arranged on the ground. But the real difficulty was learning to be part of a community that operated by rules she didn't understand. Comanche women had responsibilities and freedoms that were completely foreign to Margaret's experience. They were expected to be skilled at tanning hides, making clothing, preserving food, and caring for horses. But they also had a voice in tribal decisions, could own property in their own right, and were respected for their knowledge and wisdom. Grandmother Willow became Margaret's teacher and guide, patiently showing her how to scrape a buffalo hide until it was soft as cloth, how to identify which plants could be used for medicine, and how to read the signs that predicted weather changes. The work was hard, but Margaret found satisfaction in mastering skills that would help her family survive. The language barrier was another challenge. Margaret had picked up a little Spanish during her years on the frontier, and some of the older Comanche spoke Spanish as well as their native tongue, but to truly become part of the tribe, she needed to learn Comanche, and it was unlike any language she had ever heard. Tachawicca helped her with this, spending evenings teaching her basic words and phrases. These lessons became some of their few chances to talk privately, away from the curious eyes of the tribe and the constant chatter of the two boys. "Why did you really choose me?" Margaret asked one evening as they sat outside their teepee working on language lessons. "You could have taken Samuel without offering me anything. You could have found a Comanche woman to marry. Why make this bargain with me?" Tachawicca was quiet for a long time, carving a new arrow shaft as he considered his answer. "When I was a young man," he finally said, "I believed that strength meant taking what I wanted and destroying what opposed me. I thought the measure of a warrior was how many enemies he could kill. What changed your mind?" "My son." Tachawicca's voice grew soft. "When he was born, I realized that true strength is not in destroying but in protecting, not in taking but in giving. The day I held him for the first time, I understood that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemies but creating something good that will last after you are gone." Margaret watched as he tested the straightness of his arrow, his large hand surprisingly gentle with the delicate work. "You're trying to create something good now?" "I am trying to save 4 lives, yours, mine, and the lives of 2 boys who need parents. Little Hawk has been with us for 2 years, but he still has nightmares about the day his family died. He needs a mother who understands loss, and your son, Little Wolf, he is strong, but he will need both his worlds if he is to become the man he is meant to be." Margaret felt something shift in her chest when Tachawicca referred to Samuel as Little Wolf without any hesitation. This giant warrior, who could have simply taken her son by force, was instead trying to honor both the boy's Comanche future and his white heritage. "What do you see when you look at me?" Margaret asked. "I know I'm not what you would have chosen. If you had other options." T'Chawika set down his arrow and looked at her directly. In the firelight, his scarred face seemed less frightening and more weathered, like a mountain that had endured many storms but still stood strong. "I see a woman who tracked a war party for 3 days to try to save her friends," he said. "I see someone who is willing to sacrifice her own happiness for her child's survival. I see a person who judges others by their actions rather than their appearance." He paused. "And I see someone who understands that sometimes strength means bending instead of breaking." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to being seen so clearly, to having her motivations understood and respected rather than questioned or dismissed. "The women in the tribe," she said, changing the subject. "Some of them still don't trust me. They will. Trust must be earned, and you have only been with us for a few weeks. But already I see changes. You work hard without complaining. You are learning our ways with respect rather than trying to change them." The gathering of the chiefs took place in a wide valley where 3 rivers came together, creating rich grassland that could support hundreds of horses and thousands of people. Margaret had never seen so many Comanche in one place. The combined tribes created a temporary city of teepees that stretched as far as the eye could see. She rode into the gathering on her mare, wearing her finest Comanche dress, and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Little Wolf and Little Hawk rode beside her on their ponies, both boys excited by the spectacle of so many warriors, horses, and colorful decorations. T'Chawika rode slightly ahead, his war bonnet marking his status as a respected chief. But Margaret could feel the stares as they passed through the camp. Word had spread about the white woman who had married Stands Like Mountain, and everyone wanted to see her for themselves. Some looks were merely curious, but others held suspicion or outright hostility. Margaret kept her head high and tried to remember Grandmother Willow's advice. Show them you belong here through your actions, not your words. The formal meeting with the Council of Chiefs was set for the 3rd day of the gathering. In the meantime, Margaret tried to settle into the rhythm of camp life and prove herself through the daily activities that marked a Comanche woman's worth. She joined the other women at the river to help with washing, working alongside wives and mothers who had known no life outside the tribe. At first, conversation was stilted and careful, but gradually Margaret found herself accepted into their circle as they recognized her genuine efforts to learn their ways. "Your stitching is getting much better," commented Bluebird Woman, examining a pair of moccasins Margaret was decorating. "When you first came to us, your needlework looked like a child's." "I had good teachers," Margaret replied in Comanche, pleased that she could now hold basic conversations without constantly reaching for words. "And you learned fast," added Singing Crow, an older woman whose husband was one of the most respected war chiefs. "Some white captives never stopped trying to escape. But you worked to become one of us. This shows wisdom." Margaret felt a warm glow at the praise, but also a pang of sadness. These women spoke of white captives so casually, as if taking people from their homes was just a normal part of life. It reminded her that no matter how accepted she felt, she was living among people who had different ideas about right and wrong than the ones she had grown up with. But then she watched Little Wolf and Little Hawk racing their ponies with a group of other children, all of them laughing and shouting in a mixture of Comanche and English, and she reminded herself why she was here. The world was complicated, full of pain and injustice on all sides. The Comanche had taken her neighbors captive, but white soldiers had murdered T'Chawika's son. Both peoples had committed terrible acts in the name of survival and revenge. Margaret couldn't change the past, but she could try to create a future where boys like Little Wolf and Little Hawk could grow up understanding both worlds, maybe even bridging the gap between them. On the morning of the council meeting, Margaret woke before dawn, feeling sick with nervousness. Today would determine whether she and the boys would be allowed to stay with the tribe through the winter, or whether they would be cast out to face the approaching cold alone. T'Chawika was already awake, sitting outside the teepee and staring, at the stars. "Are you worried?" Margaret asked, settling beside him. "I am concerned," he admitted. "Some of the chiefs believe that accepting white people into our tribes makes us weak. They point to other bands that have been destroyed because they trusted the wrong outsiders. And what do you believe?" "I believe that strength comes from wisdom, not from fear, and wisdom tells me that the world is changing. The old ways of living may not survive unless we learn to adapt." He looked at her seriously. "But today, it is not my opinion that matters. It is theirs." The council was held in the largest teepee Margaret had ever seen, big enough to hold 50 people comfortably. The chief sat in a circle, each man representing his band's interests and concerns. Margaret recognized some faces from her own camp, but others were strangers whose expressions revealed nothing about their thoughts. Tachawicca spoke first, explaining how Margaret came to be with them and why he had chosen to make her his wife. He talked about Little Wolf's bravery and intelligence, about Little Hawk's healing from his early trauma, and about the skills Margaret had learned during her months with the tribe. Then it was time for the other chiefs to ask their questions. "How do we know this woman will not betray us to the white soldiers?" asked a scarred warrior whose cold eyes never left Margaret's face. "How do we know she will not teach our children to despise their Comanche blood?" asked another. "What happens when her heart calls her back to her own people? Will she steal away the boys and take our secrets with her?" Margaret answered each question as honestly as she could, speaking in Comanche and trying to project confidence even when her heart was racing. She talked about her commitment to Little Wolf and Little Hawk, about the skills she had learned and the respect she had developed for Comanche ways of life. She acknowledged that she would always mourn her first husband, but emphasized that her future was now tied to the tribe's future. But the hardest question came from an elderly chief whose weathered face spoke of many winters and many battles. "White woman who lives among us," he said formally, "what will you do when the time comes to choose between your birth people and your chosen people? For that time will come. It always does." Margaret felt the weight of every eye in the teepee upon her. This was the heart of their concern, the fear that drove their suspicion. They wanted to know where her ultimate loyalty lay. "Honored Chief," she replied carefully, "I cannot promise that such a choice will never come, but I can tell you this. My children are Comanche now. Their future is with your people, and a mother's first loyalty is always to her children's welfare." The old chief nodded slowly. "This is an honest answer, and honesty has more value than pretty promises." The formal questioning continued for hours, covering everything from Margaret's knowledge of white military tactics to her opinions about trade between the tribes and Mexican settlements. Some chiefs seemed satisfied with her answers, while others remained skeptical. Finally, Tachawicca was asked to leave the teepee with Margaret while the council deliberated in private. They waited outside in the afternoon heat, watching Little Wolf and Little Hawk play with the other children and trying not to let their anxiety show. "Whatever they decide," Tachawicca said quietly, "you have honored yourself and our family by your courage today, and if they vote to send us away, then we will face the winter together, all 4 of us. I will not abandon you and the boys no matter what the council decides." Margaret felt a rush of gratitude and something deeper. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but a profound appreciation for this man who had kept his promises and treated her with consistent respect and kindness. The sun was setting when the council finally called them back. The elderly chief who had asked the hardest question served as their spokesman. "White woman who lives among us," he said formally, "we have discussed your place among the Comanche people. Some here believe that accepting outsiders is dangerous. Others believe that wisdom and skill matter more than the color of one's skin or the place of one's birth." Margaret held her breath, waiting for the verdict that would determine her family's fate. "We have decided," the chief continued, "that you may remain with us through the winter, but this acceptance comes with conditions. You must prove yourself, not just as Stands Like Mountain's wife, but as a valuable member of our community. You must contribute your skills to the tribe's welfare, and most importantly, you must help prepare the boys, both boys, to be bridges between our world and the white world." for the time may come when such bridges are needed. Relief flooded through Margaret like a warm river. They were safe. The boys would not have to face winter in the wilderness. She had passed the test, but the chief wasn't finished. There is one more thing. Your name among us will change. You will no longer be called Many Sorrows Woman, for sorrow should not define a person's entire identity. From this day forward, you will be known as Bridgewalker Woman, for the path you travel between two worlds. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The name was both a recognition of her unique position and a mandate for her future role. She was to be a bridge between cultures, helping her sons and her tribe navigate the complex relationship between Comanche and white settlements. That night, there was a feast to celebrate the successful council and to welcome the newly named Bridgewalker, woman fully into the Comanche community. Margaret sat beside T'Chawicka, watching Little Wolf demonstrate his archery skills to a group of impressed adults, while Little Hawk told elaborate stories that made everyone laugh. They are good boys, T'Chawicka said, following her gaze. They will grow into men who can honor both their heritages. I hope so, Margaret replied. I hope we can give them enough of both worlds to help them choose wisely when they're older. You speak as if they will have to choose. Margaret looked at her husband, for that's what he truly was now. She